Turn me your Bibles, please, to the book of First Chronicles. First Chronicles. Don't know when you had the last sermon preached from the book of First Chronicles. Probably not often. I heard a missionary preach on First Chronicles 28:9, and since that time, that verse has been especially special to me. First Chronicles 28:9. I hope that God will burn His word into your heart tonight. First Chronicles. My dad would say it's before Second Chronicles if you have trouble finding it. You may have trouble finding both books, right? While you're turning there, I heard a story. This will emphasize the message tonight. The message, the title is The Greatest Thing in the World. The greatest thing, the best thing in the world, knowing God. I heard about this woman. Her name was Alice. She bought a parrot, and it didn't talk. So she went back to the pet store and said, the parrot just will not talk. What can I do? He said, why don't you buy this ladder here? That might help. She bought the ladder, took it home a couple days, still not a word. Went back to the pet store. He said, how about this swing? That might help. You know, the parrot needs to be happy. Put him on, let him swing on the swing, and maybe he'll talk then. Well, she went home, put the swing, in the cage, still nothing. And then he said, how about this little miniature tree? Put that inside the cage. That might help. A couple days later, still nothing. So then he said, how about this shiny parrot toy? Maybe he needs a toy. Maybe then he'll talk. A couple more days passed, still nothing. So now a couple of weeks have passed, and she went back to the pet store. Before it opened, she was standing outside with the cage in her hand, tears coming down her cheeks, And when the store owner got there, she cried and said, my parrot just died. Oh. And he said, well, let me ask you, did the parrot say anything before it died? She said, well, yes, actually it did. And so he leaned forward, he said, what did the parrot say? She said, the parrot said, don't they sell any bird food at that pet store? The best thing. Oh, I bought all those other things. They weren't as important as food, right? I think that put it in perspective. I saw that. I said, you know what? That has to be the introduction to this sermon, the greatest thing in the world. First Chronicles 28. I'll just read verse 9 in preparation for our study. This is the one we want to zero in on tonight. First Chronicles 28, verse 9. As for you, my son Solomon, know the God of your father. Did you hear those words? Know the God of your father, and serve him with a loyal heart, with a perfect heart, in other words, and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands all the intents of the thoughts. If you seek him, notice the promise, he will be found by you. And then the warning, but if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. These are powerful words, aren't they, that are shared by David with his son. John Wycliffe could be called the beginning of an era. Through his efforts as a Bible translator, the Reformation got its start. He was called the Morning Star of the Reformation. Remember that? The Morning Star of the Reformation, John Wycliffe. In 1384, can you imagine? He worked tirelessly to translate the whole Bible into English. And before he translated the Bible into English, Bibles were chained to the pulpits, written in Latin, only the clergy could read them. He stood alone against verbal and physical assaults, and he translated this book that we hold so dear, the Bible. And eventually, he would die for doing so. Abraham Lincoln, when he was assassinated, one person wrote, the death of Abraham Lincoln marked the end of an era. Some lives are so significant that they mark the beginning of an era. Other lives are so significant they mark the end of an era. Isn't that true? The death of David, who was Israel's greatest king, marked the end of an era. In fact, he both began and ended an era. And if you turn, you keep your finger in there, it might be easier to find the book of Acts for a moment. I'd like to just share one verse in Acts 13, Acts 13:36. This verse speaks about David. Remember, he's the only one that is described in the Bible as a man after God's own heart. Acts 13, verse 36. And the NIV, I'll read that translation. When he had fulfilled God's purpose in his life, he fell asleep, he died. Can you let those words hit home in your heart? When he fulfilled God's purpose in his life, he died. God's purpose. You know, every single person in this world has a purpose for living. Do you know that? I read an article, I think it was yesterday, and I was amazed when I read the article. It said 90%, 9 out of 10 young Britons say they have no purpose in life. 9 out of 10, 89%, ages 16 to 29, said they have no purpose in life. I read the article and I came to find out why. One of the reasons, 50% of those in Britain consider themselves atheists. So if you don't believe in God, you're not going to have much purpose in life, are you? But that really was unfathomable to me, that almost 90% of the young Britons, ages 16 to 29, have no purpose. We have a purpose, and every one of us needs to find that purpose that God has for us on this earth, and then we need to do it, don't we? That is what David did. And in 1 Chronicles 28 and 29, we have a record of the end of David's life and his last recorded words before he died. Let's pick it up in verse 1. I'm sure you found your way there now. 1 Chronicles 28:1. Now David assembled at Jerusalem all the leaders of Israel, the officers of the tribes and the captains of the divisions who served the king, the captains over thousands and captains over hundreds, and the stewards over all the substance and possessions of the king and of his sons, with the officials, the valiant men, and all the mighty men of valor. Can you picture this scene, this solemn scene, as David, king of Israel for 40 years, now is old, and he's ready to say goodbye. He's ready to die, and he gathers some of the most influential people there in Israel, perhaps hundreds or thousands of people there, and they're surrounding their beloved king. That's the scene here in verse 1. Verse 2 says, Then King David rose to his feet and said, Hear me, my brethren and my people, I had it in my heart, notice, to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and for the footstool of our God, and had made preparations to build it. But God said to me, You shall not build a house for my name, because you have been a man of war and have shed blood. So David had a dream, didn't he? His heart's desire was to build a house for God. His heart's desire, his dream, was to build the temple of God. But God said no. Have you ever had that happen to you? You have some dream, something you want to do in your life, and God closes the door. And that's what happened here. God's answer was no. David wanted to build a temple for God, the house of the Lord, and God said no. David's response is interesting. It's one that we should have when God says no to us. He didn't argue with God. He didn't question God. He did not resist God. He accepted. He accepted God's decision. Verse 4 says, However, the Lord God of Israel chose me above all the house of my father to be, and I underline these words, king over Israel forever. For he has chosen Judah to be the ruler, and of the house of Judah, the house of my father, and among the sons of my father, he was pleased with me to make me king over all Israel. You notice what David is doing here. He's not focusing on what God said he would not let him do. He's focusing on what God said he could do. That is what we also should do. Maybe we get to the end of our lives and we say, well, I have these unfulfilled dreams, these hopes that I had hoped to do, but God has closed the door. And instead of focusing on what God said you couldn't do, focus on what God says you could do for him. And that's what David is doing. The good things that God has done for him. Verses 5 to 8 says, and of all my sons, for the Lord has given me many sons, he has chosen my son Solomon. See that? Solomon. To sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. Now he said to me, it is your son Solomon who shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father. Moreover, I will establish his kingdom forever, if he is steadfast to observe my commandments and my judgments as it is this day. Now therefore, in the sight of all Israel, the assembly of the Lord, and in the hearing of our God, be careful to seek out all the commandments of the Lord your God, that you may possess this good land, and leave it as an inheritance for your children after you forever. So here we find that David decides he's going to thank God for what he could do. Imagine being the greatest king of Israel for 40 years. God had blessed his life, you see. That brings us to the main focus of our study tonight, verse 9. And I want you to put yourself in Solomon's shoes here. Can you do that? His father David has served as king of Israel for 40 years. He's now old. He's ready to pass off the scene. And these are the last recorded words of David. And picture yourself being Solomon now, young, inexperienced, perhaps nervous. You're going to be the next king following your father. Verse 9 says, David speaking to his son, as for you, my son Solomon. I wonder if his ears perked up here. Okay, what's he going to say to me? Have you ever thought about that? About if you were dying and you called your family around you, what you would say? Your last words? I think you'd choose your words carefully, wouldn't you? You wouldn't say, well, let's see, how's the weather outside? How's our favorite sports teams doing? No, you'd give them something really important. The best thing of all, the best thing in the whole world. The most important thing, that's what David starts off with. He says, know, K-N-O-W, know the God of your father. So he's actually going to give 3 challenges, but the first one, I believe it's the most critical. I want you to know God. I can't think of anything more important in all the world, can you, than knowing God? In 1973, James Innes Packard wrote a book. Maybe you've read it before, you've heard about it, Knowing God. Have you heard that book? It was, they voted, it was number 5 on the most influential books for evangelicals. Number 5. I'd like to know what 1, 2, 3, and 4 were. I'm not sure what they were. But Knowing God, one of my favorites. And Dad and I love J.I. Packer's writing. Amen. Certainly. But knowing God, nothing is more important. What were we made for, J.I. Packer asks. And also, what should be our aim in life? If you had to answer that question, how would you answer it? He answered it this way. To know God. That's it. So David looks into the eyes of his son Solomon, and he says, know the God of your father, Solomon. Know God. That's the most important. I want you to make sure that you know God. Know the Lord. Now it almost seems too obvious to mention it, doesn't it? Of course he wants him to know God. Well, if we're going to emphasize something to our child, and these are the last words we're going to say, we want them to remember these words. And even though it's obvious, we need to say it, don't we? I can't think of anything more important for Krista. If I were dying, I would say, make sure you know my God. That's all. That's the most important thing that you could do. And so David chooses his words carefully. He says, Solomon, I want you to know the Lord. That's so critical. I remember seeing the side of a truck. I was crossing the Ben Franklin Bridge, took my wife to work, and I was crossing the bridge. I saw a truck that said, "Life is short, eat dessert first." I thought, now what in the world, what kind of truck is that? The Philadelphia Classic Cake Company. That sounds like a cake company slogan, right? Life is short, eat dessert first. I remember another sign on the side of the truck, it said, above all else, we need lightning rods. Above all else. Well, above all else, the world needs Jesus, right?
Amen.
And we need to know God. That's the most important. So if you, those of us who are parents, if you could pull your child aside before you died and you were going to give them instructions, let me challenge you first of all to say, make sure you say what David did. Make sure you know God. That's the most important. Know the God of your father. Don't make the same mistake I did, Solomon, okay? Remember, he was the son of Bathsheba. So don't make the same mistake I did. Make sure you know God personally, know him deeply, know him intimately. Our family was on vacation at the Ocean City Baptist Church, and we heard a speaker there, Dr. Alden Gannett. I don't know if anybody heard that name. Powerful preacher. Really, really powerful preacher. He was old and a powerful man of God. He made the statement, which I've never forgotten. It's been decades since I heard him. He said, every earnest Christian wants to know God better. Every earnest Christian wants to know God better. That's our desire. And that's what David is telling Solomon. I want you to know God. That's number one. Number two, he says, I want you to serve the Lord. Look at verse 9 again. Know the God of your father and serve him with a loyal or a perfect heart and with a willing mind. So after impressing upon his son Solomon that he wants him to know God, then he says, I want you to serve him too. And notice he says how, or he explains what he means. He said, I want you to serve God with a loyal heart. The word loyal means with a perfect heart. In other words, I want you to serve God with your whole heart. Do you serve God with your whole heart? You should. Don't hold anything back. Serve him wholeheartedly. Remember Caleb in the Old Testament? I believe 6 times we find those words in the Old Testament, that Caleb served the Lord. He followed God wholeheartedly. That's what David says to Solomon. I want you to know God, and then after you know him, I want you to serve him with all of your heart. Not only that, he goes on to say, with a willing mind. Don't serve the Lord because you have to. Serve him because you want to. See? Remember Walt Pritchard years ago? He used to play the trumpet for our church. Walt Pritchard. He used to play a song. I haven't heard it for many years. Make me willing to be willing. Willing. We have to serve the Lord. Don't do it because you have to. Do it because you want to. I was thinking about that. You know, I love to serve the Lord. As the song says, there's joy in serving Jesus. Even just mowing the church lawn. I was thinking about that. We've had this church since, I think, 1985 or so, somewhere around there. I thought, wow, 40 years. Am I doing the math correctly? If we mowed the lawn, let's see, I figured out about 30 times a year. I've mowed this lawn about 1,000 times. But you know what? Every time I mow it, I enjoy doing it. That's service. Serve the Lord. See? Whatever you do, serve the Lord with your whole heart. Don't hold anything back. And then also do it because you want to, not because you have to. Do it willingly. Why? It says, for the Lord searches all hearts and understands all the intents of the thoughts. He knows our hearts, doesn't he? He knows our minds. He knows what you're thinking right now. If you want to go home and eat that ice cream or whatever, or if you're thinking about the message, right? He knows what's in our minds. Then it says, if you seek him. This is the third thing. So after David says, I want you to know the Lord, know the God of your father. Then he says, I want you to serve the Lord wholeheartedly, willingly. And then finally, he says, I want you to seek God. Seek the Lord. Seek Him. And you look at people in the world today, some people are seeking after money. Some people are seeking material things. Some people are seeking pleasure, fame. What are you really seeking? What is it that you're longing for in your life? David says, Solomon, I want you to seek the Lord. I'm not sure if you heard about the two brothers, Philip and Robert Ong. Anybody hear about them? The richest people in Singapore, they're brothers. They're worth over $12 billion. But the interesting thing about them, I was reading their testimony. They're the Christians. And this is what they said, if I can find it here. These two brothers were talking about what matters most in life. And it says, Singapore's richest man, Philip Ong, and his brother, who worth over $12 billion, said the greatest treasure in life is the peace and joy of his faith in Jesus Christ. He said he wishes everybody had what he did. He said there was something missing in my life. Then I realized that missing piece was Jesus. Isn't that amazing? He said it sure beats a lot of money. Isn't that amazing? What a testimony. He knew what to seek. And so David challenges Solomon, don't seek wealth, don't seek riches, seek the Lord. That's what he challenges him with. And my wife was sharing with me Manny Pacquiao. Anybody here follow boxing? Manny Pacquiao? I don't really follow boxing too much, but he is one of the greatest boxers of all time. He is the only 8-division world champion in the history of boxing. And this is interesting. The second highest paid athlete in the world as of 2015. I don't know who number one is. He's made a lot of money. But Gemma shared with me that on television she saw, he was asked, what is your greatest achievement in life? You know what he said? Knowing Jesus Christ.
Amen.
See? He said, receiving Jesus Christ into my heart, that's the greatest achievement in my life. He said, without God, we're nothing. My success is not about wealth and fame. Most important to me is my relationship with Jesus Christ. Isn't that great to hear?
Amen.
That's what David was telling Solomon. Seek the Lord, Solomon. Remember the Old Testament says that the kings were warned not to multiply 3 things. Remember what those 3 things? Don't multiply wives, horses, and chariots, right? Don't multiply wives, because if they worship pagan gods, they're going to turn your heart away from God. Don't multiply horses and chariots. I want you to trust me, not the horses and chariots for battle. That's what God was saying. And here David is saying, I want you to seek the Lord with your whole heart. Seek God. So we need to know the Lord, we need to serve Him, and maybe you've heard the name, have you heard Robert Gilmore Letourneau before? Anybody hear that name before? R.G. Letourneau. If you go by a construction site, you see the big bulldozers and all those big machines. He invented or designed every single one of them. He said, there's no big jobs, only small machines. But he was a Christian, and he gave 90% of his income to the Lord. He kept 10% for himself. You say, well, he was wealthy. Sure, he could do that. How many wealthy people you know are giving 90% to the Lord? Not many. When he was 16 years old, he was unsaved. He was raised in a Christian home. But he described his life at that time. He was on the wrong road, going the wrong way. And then he was saved. He quit school, I think, after the 8th grade. The place where he was working, the foundry where he worked, burned to the ground after he was saved. And he was out of work. He moved to San Francisco in the 1906 earthquake, left his second-floor apartment. He left his second-floor apartment as it reached ground level. That's what was happening to him. He moved to Stockton, California, and he became an auto mechanic. He suffered a broken neck in a stock car crash. He survived a gasoline-doused flash fire in his repair shop. He nearly died of Spanish influenza. He was plunged into bankruptcy by an inept business partner. But the turning point of his life, after all those things, you think that'd be enough, right? After the turning point of his life was when his firstborn son, less than 4 months old, died. And he didn't argue with God. He looked at his life and he said, what's wrong? And he realized, he said, God spoke to me and said, you're not seeking me first. Seek first the kingdom of God. Remember what it says in Matthew 6:33? He said he wasn't doing that. Now I share his story because he used to, when he felt that God was speaking to him to go out and tell his story. What a story, right? To people. And he was so nervous he didn't want to do it. But he eventually did. He was pretty gruff in the way he said things, and this is what he used to say. It's true, but it's hard for us to hear it maybe. If you're not serving the Lord, he said, it proves you don't love the Lord. And if you don't love the Lord, it proves that you don't know him. Because to know him is to love him. And to love him is to serve him. See? So the challenge that David gave to his son was, know the Lord, serve the Lord, seek the Lord. I'd like to close with an illustration. In a church service one Sunday, the offering plate came to a little girl who was sitting on the aisle, and she took the offering plate and she did something that they had never seen before. She took the offering plate from the usher, she put it in the aisle, and she stood inside of it. And the usher, as you might imagine, was a little bit taken aback. He said, what are you doing? She said, well, in Sunday school I learned that we're supposed to give ourselves to God. I didn't have any money, so I thought I'd give it myself. Isn't that great? So this is a challenge I want to give to each one of us as we close. Wow, it wasn't one of the first times I closed early, right? Stuff that closed the service early. Know God. Serve him. And seek him. Can you remember those 3 points? That's, I think we're going to stop there. We won't have a closing hymn. Let's stand, and we'll be dismissed to prayer. We'll go home a few minutes early tonight. How about that? Okay? Tell George I ended early, okay?